representativity in your way. But I'm interested in when I select the schools for my study. For example, if I select 4 schools, I'm sure that they represent a variation. I'm sure that perhaps there's a big school, a smaller school, or rural school, or whatever you go for parameters. Or if you select students, you're sure to have various kind of voices. If you're interested in social background, you perhaps will have someone from families, underprivileged families, someone from working class families, someone from privileged families, but depending on your research question, you will try to go for the variation. Because you would say to the quantitative person, yet your focus is not on statistical generalization, you are interested in the depth of richness of diverse contexts. So you have a different research, let's say research paradigm here. And also, the quantitative person might say, but how are you ensure that when you do the analysis that you do the measurement accurate? And the qualitative person will say, but it's not that I think my validity is objective. I don't think that my analysis will be done by the same, will be the same if someone else did it. But what I'm careful about is to be transparent about my process, so people reading it can understand the steps that I took. So you would go from credibility to build that through the openness about your research position and the context and your analytic decisions. Be very transparent about that. And finally, the quantitative person might say, but what about this statistics in inference? And you will say, well, you are not interested in generalizability that way. You are interested in how does anyone from similar context, will they recognize what I found here? Perhaps you have several schools in your study that remind of each other. And you can say, well, at least at these schools that I selected, there was this cross-pattern trend. So hopefully it can be found other places. But you will not state that this is generalizable. So that's not the point. The point is, with qualitative research, you can answer the whys, and the quantitative research can help you get the overview. So sometimes these things work well together, right? Because the statistical thing can see, okay, we can see there's some problems here, but we don't know why. And then the qualitative methodologies can help you with that. So the point here is that qualitative research is not less rigorous, it's different. It's different tradition. It seeks deep understanding and concept sensitivity and meaning making rather than prediction. So there's some different research interest in that. Okay, so with that, why engage in qualitative research? And I will showcase some examples for you. One example is from primary school, from what we have that is called the school project. It's a longitudinal project, so we follow the same children for a 10-year period. That's a long time, with many interviews on the way. We also interview their families, and we do ethnographic field work. It's inspired by the science capital framework, and I will not dwell into that now. Okay, so we are in a science class. The light suddenly turns out because the sensors have not registered movement for a while. The teacher and students wave their arms in the air to turn the light back on. And a student suddenly turns to the anthropologist and whispers, "It's just because we're so quiet." And this quietness was something several of the students told us about. Like in science class, you need to be quiet. You have to be more quiet in other subjects. And we were interested to understand, why are they talking about this quietness in science? Because science should also be experimental and engaging. And so why do students all the time talk about that? So we had that as a focus in one of our research interests. And also having, I always said that, okay. So I want to share an example of you that is one example of why there is the quietness in science class. Okay, during the break, the teaching explored snow and ice because it just snowed outside on the playground. They observed how the ice cracks and behaves differently when they throw stones on it, and how the water moves under the ice when they press on the surface. The children use movement, touch, and observation to understand the phenomenon. For example, one girl stepped on the ice and noticed how the water shifts and moves back underneath. She describes her observation as the movement of the water when I press down and it goes back again. Some could argue that what the kids are doing here could be science relevant because they're looking at movement of water and ice, so there would be a natural bridge into some of the science discussions perhaps. But what happens is that when the kids come in, they take all their wet snow clothes off and sit down to the science class. The teacher said, so the next theme is spring, and we need to talk about spring temperature and flowers. And it's so far away for the kids because it's snowing outside and it's winter. But the teacher just reached that point in the curriculum, and that was the next theme. So the teacher went into that. This is an example, and there was many more in this project about how sometimes there's a disconnection of children's lives and what is happening in science class. And you could say there is many good explanation of that, the curriculum, the evaluation, all the things that interact with that. But from the kids' point of view, it's when we interviewed them, they were like, when we asked them, how does science match your everyday life? And they said, well, there's no science in my everyday life. And in particular, the kids with low science capital, like the ones that did not have families that provided them with after-school science activities or a chemistry equipment present, went to Christmas or whatever have you. So the kids from underprivileged backgrounds in particular found that science had nothing to do with them. It was nothing to do with their life. They could not see all the science surrounding them. And we found that this was not being, that connection was really difficult. It was hard for us to see that connection being made in the science teaching, unfortunately. So this was one of the reasons why we find the silence in science class. Another one is that there is a very narrow focus on science terminology. So we asked one girl that explains what science, no, it was actually one girl asking another girl, and what is science concept? And she said, it's those big words no one really understands. So like, there is in the practice of science class in primary school, there's a lot of focus on pronouncing and using scientific terms the right way, discussions. And a lot of studies actually show that in order to learn science terminology, you need to practice them. You need not to be just ask a question and say the right word. There needs to be a dialogue or hands-on activity in order for you to remember that. But we didn't see that happening. And again, there's a lot of studies showing that in particular students from lower socio-economic backgrounds, they have a shorter linguistic syntax. They know less words. They don't know all these alien words, difficult words. For them in particular, it's difficult just to remember the science terminology. So it seems that some students are privileged by that focus where we just expect that they know the words when saying them out loud. So there's some of the practices that also make students silence if they are asked about terminology questions. Some students might rather hold back. Okay, and this is related to one student in 8th grade. He actually said, and several students said something alike, in science you have to be quiet, listening, and smart. And also some students said you need to know stuff in advance because when the teacher asks you, you need to know it from back home. So there's a lot of things going on here that help us explain the silence in science class that is deeply dependent on qualitative methodologies for us to be in the classroom, observing what happens, but also interviewing all the kids. So in conclusion for this part, and then I have one part left, the ICE example shows how children explore the natural world through curiosity, play, and hands-on experimentation. But when they return to the classroom, their spontaneous experiences are not drawn into the structured and very concept-based science teaching, where the focus is on terminology. The disconnect reflects a broader challenge. School science often relies on implicit connections to students' everyday life, meaning that students need to make those connections themselves. meaning that those who already have relevant knowledge of the cultural resources to make the links themselves are the one who can do it. And in this way, teaching tends to support those with higher science capital, while others struggles to see themselves in science. So I rushed through the conclusions, but I hope you see the point here. I just have 2 examples from the secondary school before we go into a discussion. Okay, so here we are in a project where we use observations and interviews in our secondary school, that is senior high, and in particular we are in the physics, chemistry and technology classroom. And we are particularly interested in the fact that young women in senior high select science subjects, but when it comes to higher education, they say, well, it's not for me. So what happens in senior highs that make them believe that science is not for them? So here's some of the things that we found through qualitative methods. A lot of studies have shown that young women tend to rate their own abilities lower than young men. So even they get the similar grades, young women tend to, at least in Western context, to say, oh no, I cannot do it. And young men are like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that I'm okay. So there's like a lot of surveys that have shown that. So we were like trying to see, can we see how this looks like in the classroom? And the funny thing is, or the sad thing is, that this is in science that young women rate their own abilities. They don't do it in history, for example, or English language classes. Okay, so I have 1 example from an ethnographic fieldwork that I will show to you that can help us understand how this is co-produced in the classroom. This is from the physics classroom. So, we look at least in Denmark, students sometimes in physics goes to the board and show a proof. Sometimes the teachers say, oh, would you like Camilla to go to the board and make this proof? Perhaps you have the same here. And we can see that the teacher, when there's young women at the board, offer more help to the women, meaning the young women, meaning that the young women are prompted more and are asked more questions than the young men. So what does this actually mean, we thought? In an interview, we talked to, for example, Emma here, who says, well, if I have to present something on the board, I spend a lot of time preparing it because I'm afraid I won't be able to explain it if the teacher asks a question and I look like an idiot. So I feel that if I'm going to present, I need to know everything. I need to know it all. So it seems like some of the young women, they kind of use a lot of time on preparation. And actually the teacher is aware of this because in the interview he says, well, sometimes it's easier with the boys. They speak more casually and sometimes they are even unprepared. And then it's easier to forgive them if they make a mistake. This means the teacher will have different expectations to the young women and the young men. And meaning that it kind of co-produces this insecurity within the young women of believing that they are not good enough. So what we did with this examples and other things is we worked with this group of teachers in physics in trying to find other ways to handle proofs at the board, but that's another story. But just to give you an example of how qualitative research can provide you with some of this in-depth knowledge. And we use as concept, and I will not delve into that now, that is called celebrated identities, that has to do with which practices and positions are supported in teaching, who and what are celebrated. For instance, being non-prepared and just taking risks at the board might be celebrated, and that interact with different students differently. Both gender and social background can come into play. Okay, another thing we found, this is from the chemistry lab, is at least in Denmark, when you go to the chemistry lab, students will often be working in groups, and they will know that they will get a prescription of what they're going to do, and then they will divide who is doing what in the group. We do a lot of group work. I don't know whether that's the same here. And here's some of the things you do in the chemistry lab, examples of that. You, for example, discuss the experiment, you handle the lab equipment, you get the liquids, you clean the equipment. There's a lot of different tasks. And what we saw here was some inequalities, because if the teaching is very open-ended and the teaching is not structured and students need to learn all those competences, some students actually all the time cleaned lab equipment. They never got to the high taxonomy learning tasks. So some students had very few roles, and some students had lower level tasks, like the cleaning that I said, finding materials, etc. And some of the students that had higher taxonomy learning tasks, for example, discussing the experiment or writing in the report, were very privileged students, so students with social privileged backgrounds. So we could see some differences of the division of labor in the chemistry classroom that created some inequalities in actually who could gain the specific competences, who had access to the competences in the chemistry lab. Again, an example of how observation can help you with seeing some of these patterns. And there's a paper out on that as well. A final example I will give you is one on the use of longitudinal methods. What can we use longitudinal methods for? And actually some of the word recognition, who is recognized and who is not, recognition practices and classroom norms, not just interest or talent. It reveals subtle patterns of inequalities and non-participation, often missed by quantitative studies, because in qualitative studies we have the opportunity to go in depth. And ethnographic fieldworks allows for focus on exclusion mechanisms that play behind our backs in everyday life, also in teaching. How can we see that? Well, we also need to think about curriculum and student whatever. So if not thinking about this plays behind our back. So for example, insecurity and marginalization, it's reproduced through our everyday teaching practices if we do not think about it. And also longitudinal insights following students over time helps trace the complex pathways that leads to choosing or opting out of STEM education. And it shifts qualitative focus, shifts the focus from fixing students to transforming educational practices and structures. And finally, giving voice to underrepresented groups is something that is possible with qualitative research. Okay, so let me just see. If you want to dive into more, we have many publications for the past years that reflect some of this work, and I will be happy to share the slides with you afterwards. But what I would like you to do now is, when I stop talking, to talk with the person next to you about two things and be ready to ask questions if you have them. What in particular do you find useful with qualitative methods? What would you find challenging when using qualitative methods? And a final question, can you relate to this in an Indonesian classroom? So talk just a few minutes to the person next to you and be ready to share. And I'm very open to questions in Indonesian. I will have them translated, so please be ready to share some of your thinking with me. Go ahead, talk to the person next to you.
Baik, selanjutnya Bapak Ibu, silakan kita diberikan waktu untuk berdiskusi dengan teman sebelah kita beberapa menit ke depan. Apa yang kedua kan kesulitan kan? Menarik mungkin dari penelitian kualitatif ini dan apa yang menjadi tantangan terkait penelitian kualitatif ini, silakan didiskusikan. Dapatkan
tadi disuruh tanya, maksudnya disuruh diskusi
konteks pembelajaran awal di Indonesia. Setelah berdiskusi mungkin bisa mengajukan pertanyaan kepada narasumber.
Sampai mana keberhasilannya? Dan kira-kira silakan diskusi. Apa Research is the limit of time. Makanya menurut saya ganti.
Oke, itu kalau ada pertanyaan yang mau langsung diajukan boleh ya. Tidak.
Iya, tadi ketemu di lift.
Okay, sorry. I want to ask, I'm Ian, and my first in I have experience about qualitative research. Yeah, in my bachelor thesis. In my bachelor thesis, di dalam skripsi saya ini membicarakan analytical deductive. Analytical di dalamnya itu menganalisis situasi dinamis. Jadi menganalisis proses pembelajaran. Nah, dalam proses pembelajaran itu bagaimana interaksi dari siswa dan siswa. Nah, dan didapat juga mungkin hampir sama ya di sini. Cuma kalau yang tadi buat contoh yang menunjukkan banyaknya itu interview sebelum dan sesudah. Nah, juga tadi ada di contoh yang kedua itu
Literatur review kan bukan penelitian, bukan penelitiannya.
Itu bukan kata kunci dari qualitative research.
Ini tuh tadi yang kita ngisi tadi tuh kualitatif di pikiran kalian tuh apa?
Nah itu yang tanya.
Dia nggak sih?
Biasanya kan yang penting itu ya refleksi gitu nah interpretasi. Berarti dia nanya dulu apa namanya pretestnya. Gambaran umum kita tentang itu ya. Kualitatif kan kuantitatif.
Wah, ini lagi bahas Bali.
Enggak yang
Itu tuh dia tuh kalau nggak salah tuh kualitatif pertanyaannya.
jadi kita kan masuk ke sini jadi nggak tahu.
Pas tadi yang Mentimeter itu
Harus kita datang kan kesini mengisi kan kita
tidak mengisi.
sama kan kita mengisi.
apakah di
Dia yang orang terima.
negara
Apa dengerin
Jangan
nggak
berdoa.
bingung.
Sedang merangkai kata untuk bertanya, soalnya aku sangat ingin bertanya tentang
Iya kak. Lanjut kak. Semangat kak. Aku mendukungmu.
Udah semangat.
untuk mencari riset kata kunci yang digunakan biasanya wali. Iya. Pelajaran itu biasanya ditanyakan dulu apakah ada ini kan dari tadi kita mempelajari mengenai interview setelah sebelumnya. Nah, kalau misalnya apakah ada juga yang bisa membahas mengenai saat pembelajaran. Jadi basisnya itu bukan interview tapi kayak misal kita transkrip atau tadi secara di dalam proses pembelajaran.
Dari Pak siapa ya?
Rian.
Pak Rian.
Yeah.
Pak Rian. Okay, thank you Pak Rian. So, Pak Rian is very interested with your papers. He doing some maybe similar things in his undergraduate studies. He doing didactical research, planning some lesson plan and so on, observing students' interaction and something like that. But he is curious. Is there in your country on your research, from the explanation, it's more focused on before and after interview. They ask, is there any research that you may observing the process of learning, maybe from students' transcription, you record student interaction or dialogue, and then you transcript the dialogue and some you found something from the in process of learning. And the second question is, if we want to try qualitative research, is there any keyword we could Googling to start qualitative research?
If there's, sorry, the keyword?
Keywords.
Okay, so thank you so much for your question, and thank you for sharing your experiences. I'm happy to know that it's related to an Indonesian context. So your first question, I think, yes, there's many different methods in terms of doing it before and after. I think I have done mostly the longitudinal version of that, but I know some colleagues have kids drawing concept maps before a class and after class. Do you know concept maps? Concept maps is where students, they draw kind of some circles with different concepts, and then they make errors in how they think they relate. And sometimes this is used in teaching. Also, students can write learning diary. It's a qualitative method, but it's writing. And then you can, as you said, have interviews. And I think if you do that and you have particular interest in particular learning issues, it would be a more structured interview, whereas some of the interviews I now presented were more open. So structured interviews means that you know exactly what you want to ask about. But be careful not to be so structured so you do not allow for surprises. But I think there's various methodologies there. I have not worked that much with learning, like in particular, I'm into more students' identities and experiences. So, but I know some of my colleagues are working on that. Also, there is an interview approach called Think Aloud, an interview where students, they are presented with some assignment and they explain how they would solve it. So there's various approaches to that. So the final thing is like keywords to think about when doing qualitative research. I think try interviewing someone before interviewing a student. Try it out, because sometimes you need to practice not to talk too much yourself, because in everyday conversation, it's unpolite not to talk in a conversation. But as an interviewer, you will have to step a bit more back, and your role is to have the interviewee elaborate. So it takes some practice in doing that. So you need to figure out how to. Often I will do a very elaborated interview. I will not ask all questions. So I will, in one column, have the questions that I want to ask in all interviews. But then we'll have some help questions. So if I have a student and I ask, okay, so how was this physics class? And the student say, good. Then you need to figure out how to have that student elaborate. Okay, what do you mean by good? Oh, just good. Can you give me an example of what good luck looks like? Have you had that similar teaching another time? Blah, blah, blah. So try to think of so many helping questions as possible. And then practice that with some of your peers. Interview each other before you walk out. Do some pilot interviews before you walk out in the classroom. But my next advice would be just do it. Because you need to make mistakes before doing the perfect version. And if being afraid of throwing yourself out there, perhaps just try it. And instead of having very open approaches as the one I used here, I'm very experienced. I worked with this many years. Perhaps it's okay to be a bit more focused or a bit more structured. So think about what would be the easiest way for you, and that's perfectly fine, and then try that out. Final advice, think of how you select the one you interview. Think about having some kind of variation so you get different voices. So I think that would be my advice for you. Thank you. And please, other questions also. You're also very welcome to share any challenges or hesitations, or I would never ever use this strange method. Everything is welcome.
Nanya nggak? Nah aja lah nanya.
Okay, yes, please.
Ada?
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Henriette. I'm a master's student in physics education. I come from Banten, a region in Indonesia known for the Baduy community, who strictly preserve their traditional ways of life and live in harmony with nature. Their lifestyle is low in technology, but show a deep, intuitive understanding of natural phenomena. From your perspective, as an expert in qualitative research and science education, how can we explore the indigenous knowledge of the Baduy, ethnographic fieldwork, yes, and particularly an implicit physics concept they apply in their life using qualitative methods? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's a very good question. And you said Banten?
Banten.
Yeah.
Before I'm studying at Sultan Tertarik State University.
I just came from Serang visiting the university.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I think you pointed
Tirta ya? Banten.
and I think actually that relates also to the diversity of students that see the resources that different people have and the science that's in their life. And I think researching that ethnographically would be a great resource to see some of the concepts that they might invisibly or implicitly work with. And there's, I think, would be different approaches for you to take in that. Some projects currently follow what is called the citizen science approach. And in citizen science, you will work with indigenous communities and also other communities in trying to work, be part of their life for a while, and then try to both learn from their way of doing science, but perhaps also try to exchange what you know about science with them. So it's kind of teaching in practice, teaching science with them in practice, but without trying to put stuff on them saying their knowledge is wrong and your knowledge is right, but working with them to kind of bridge science to their world. There could be ethnographic methods where you kind of have a kind of, not objective role, but a very kind of activist role in trying to work with them on specific issues. That's also okay. Angela Barton from the US is an example of one who really works with more kind of activist approaches and indigenous people. So I think that could be a really nice research area And I think it relates to some of my examples with students that could not see science in their life, that some indigenous groups, they already have science practices inherited in traditions, but they might not know that it's science, and that could be a nice bridging of that. So depending on what you're interested in, you could also have a more targeted approach, where you kind of make short observations of specific things and a few interviews. I think each could do. You could do case-based studies out there, but I think working with indigenous knowledge is something in science, you could say, research field in science education. I have not done that myself, but I really think there's a lot of interesting stuff coming up of that, so good luck with that. There was other hands, so I'm happy that you asked questions. It's nice.
Hello, Professor. I'm Nala from physics education student. Before that, I'm sorry if my question is a little out of topic. First, in Indonesia, there is a tendency for students to perceive a teacher, especially basic teacher, as intimidating.
As what, sorry?
Intimidating.
Yeah.
This creates a sense of disconnect between teacher and student. How can this be minimized, and how can teacher build better connection with their student? And then is the method used to for male and female student is same? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well done. Yeah, so we use the same research methods to begin with your last questions. And the example I gave you, there's also studies of all students. Here it was just the female students we focused on. But we use the same methods there, but we use different theoretical perspectives. So there would be some masculinity studies, and so there would be different resources to draw on in terms of what we could be interested in. But when we use the concept of celebrating identities, we look at all students with a particular focus, in this case, on the female ones. To your first question, that's a difficult one for me to solve. I don't think I can solve that. I don't know, because I haven't been in the Indonesian primary school, second or high school yet. And there's something about power relationship, perhaps, that could be in the way you perceive the teacher, that provides a gap sometimes between how you can access, bridge into students' everyday life. So perhaps trying to even the power imbalance out. And I think you are more expert in that than me, because I don't know the Indonesian context. But I know in Denmark that some teachers that kind of either shift context going out of the classroom, sometimes experience that this helps, or sometimes doing activities that involves the kids' families, or sometimes ask the kids to do some experiments at home. For example, I heard a chemistry teacher that asked the kids to take different things that they thought had a low pH value at home. And they brought all kinds of things, and then they experimented with the things from the kids' background. So I think bringing the kids' life into the school setting is another way to work with that. And I think that can be done in many different ways. I also know a teacher who did, in Denmark, we have conversation with the teacher and the family, with feedback to the parents about how is things going in school. And that teacher, she visited homes instead of parents visiting schools. So I think there could be many different ways of working with that. But I'm not the expert in the Indonesian context, so perhaps you can use some of these ideas further. But I wish you the best of luck with that at least.
Greetings, Professor. My name is Zahra. Thank you for your presence. I really enjoy your presentation. It's pretty thought-provoking.
Yes.
Indeed, I have several questions that need to be congruent. Before that, I will give you a context. So, as we know, broadly known, qualitative research is heavily relies on researchers' interpretation, which can introduce a personal bias and potentially affect objectivity. Researchers always engage in what we call reflexivity to manage this challenge, right? My question is, what if my reflection is really subjective and differs substantially from those of others, including my supervisor? As in such case, is it still possible to produce research that is unbiased and objective? The following question is, how can I be a close to ideal qualitative researcher? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, there were so many dimensions in that, so let me see where to begin with. First thing, and I will provoke again perhaps, I also think quantitative studies are biased. I think you cannot do any methods without bias. I think you can work with your biases, but the most important thing is you're transparent about the method. Because I know quantitative methods also have interpretation. You also use some kind of interpretation to see that. And I'm not sure if you or your supervisor or someone else agrees to make it more reliable. So from a qualitative research perspective, you would say, yes, that's why I have a theory. This is my theory, this is my analytic approach, so everyone can see what I did. But of course, I don't claim that what the analysis I did, that you would do the same. But I think that's why it's important that if we use the same theoretical frame and we use the same analytical steps, hopefully we will get to some of the same things, right? But we are not claiming in qualitative research that we are objective. We are claiming that we are transparent, so everyone can see what we did. Where I think the problem sometimes, that's the provocative part in quantitative research, is to say, now this is objective, and 2 lines under it, and everyone can apply it. I don't believe so. I also believe that quantitative methods is contextual. If I had a survey from Denmark and I asked all of you to use it, it might not be the right questions that I put in there for your context. And even if we use the same questions, your students might respond with different interpretation. If you ask them about something physics, they might be thinking on different things because they were taught in different schools, in different local environments. So for me, quantitative, we kind of pretend objectivity, and I think we should be careful with it. But that, I know, I'm very provocative from a qualitative perspective, right? So I think theory is key. So these studies, I did not delve much into theory, but the community that I publish in, the journals, it's key that I show quite clearly what concepts I use to do the interpretation. So it's not just my kind of own ideas, but it's based on solid research. So I think there's a discussion here about quantitative objectivity and qualitative transparency that's always coming up. But I think it's interesting for us to always be critical to our approach. So thank you for your question.
Okay, thank you. My name is Henriette from Physics Education 2023. There are a few questions that I would like to ask. And I emphasized it before because if the questions are out of topic. So the first question, I'm interested and curious about one of the methods discussed earlier, namely art-based methods, which are, there may be many other methods they are similar to these methods, which in practice have the same question regarding how we can process the results so that they can provide a good assessment or conclusion in the end. Which, as mentioned, the advantages of the qualitative method earlier are transparent reflexivity and contextual resonance. Do we have to have our own expertise, like in the field of psychologists and the expertise or competencies in psychology? And for the second question is, here in Indonesia, we are facing problems related to the intensive curriculum changes in recent years, which in turn distracts students from what they should be focusing on, which is learning, of course. Even not only students, but also the teachers and myself as a future teacher. So the question is, how does the curriculum affect the implementation of this qualitative research in schools? And maybe you can share or tell us how the curriculum development in your country. Thank you.
Thank you. Please keep the microphone because I didn't catch all the things. So let's begin and then keep the microphone so I can ask you whether I understood it right. Okay, so one thing you asked about, the final question was about the curriculum, right? And I think this is a general tendency that there's so much curriculum pressure, meaning that the teacher might know that this is not the best learning opportunity, but I just need to have it done because I need to go to the next topic or whatever. So I think sometimes there's a discrepancy about all the teaching plans that we need to do and what we see could be best opportunities for student learning. And I think that's a horrible sometimes situation here that we find ourselves in as teachers, that we know I cannot get to all the students now because I need to get to the next topic. So that's a challenge. I think the thing about, and this is where I wonder whether I heard you correctly, the reflexivity. Do we all know have to be psychologists? And I don't think we all have to be psychologists, but I think as physicists, you also need to consider students learning from that interact with student background or student preferences and students' opportunities where they see in so many different spaces. So if you're not aware of that, you will only be seeing the good students and the bad students without perhaps knowing that the bad students are situated in really challenging environments. So I think we need to reflect on as teachers somehow, not going to be psychologists. I think some of these qualitative methods could also work in an everyday practice as teachers. It's not only in research. And that's what brings me to the art-based methods that we began with. You said something about art-based methods, or what? I didn't hear the first question.
Yeah, art-based methods.
Yes, yeah. And what did you want to ask? Sorry, because I didn't get that.
Yeah, like how we can process for the results. Like we can get the conclusion or for the assessments example.
So I think one thing is in the classroom, another thing is in research. And in our research, we use the art-based methods as part of the methods. But I saw papers coming out where they only used art-based methods. Art-based methods covers a huge variety of things. And I use them very different to different target groups. Small kids draw, people who only use art-based methods. People who only use art-based methods, but I use them always in a combination. And I think as teachers, it can be a tool for student learning also to have them draw their learning in different ways. And I think being creative there sometimes give you access to some other things that they might not be able to put down in words. So there is some asset there, some strength there that hopefully you could also use as a teacher.
Okay, thank you for the chance given to me. My name is Elvira. I'm a
master student of physics education. Maybe this is a simple question, but I think it is really important for us as a master student because we have to collect data in quantitative method and qualitative method at the same time. And it is related with your second question about the challenges in qualitative method. One of the challenges of conducting research using the qualitative method in Indonesia is the limitation of time. For example, we have to make a research in implementation of project-based learning to improve the creativity thinking skill of secondary school, and we have to make a project learning, and it takes a long time to do the project, and it also takes a long time to us to collect the data in qualitative method. For example, as we do the observation or interview. So my question is, based on your experience, how can we as a researcher conduct qualitative research effectively even we have a limit of time? Maybe that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Not a simple question, but I think also in research projects, big one like the ones I have, it's always a time issue. So I really relate to that. And so I think one simple way of doing that, if you know who responded to your survey and you see different interesting patterns in your survey, you could select different students that represent different trends for interviewing. So for example, you could have a survey where it comes up that students, they have experience to teaching in 4 different categories or something. So I think then it could be interesting to have 4, at least, interviews with one student from each category, where you kind of ask the why. Why is it so? The whys that you cannot cover in survey because they are big research questions. We cannot investigate the whole world, so we will end up by saying we recommend that future studies they can dive into this further because we can see something is going on here, but we didn't have sufficient research to cover this area as well. So I think taking small steps and trying to use the survey as a platform for more structured focus in qualitative research could be a way to go around that. I hope that could work. And there's also people upstairs, so if any one of you upstairs have any questions, you just really need to wait. There's some questions upstairs as well, I can see that.
Yeah.
We can take the question here, and then afterwards perhaps go upstairs, so people upstairs.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and especially our professor. It's such a pleasure to meet you here. So, my name is Afifa, and please allow me to voice the questions that have been haunted my mind about this particular topic. So, the first question is, if AI can analyze qualitative data, like for example the result of student interviews, will student-centered research lose its soul when interpretation is outsourced to algorithms? And the second question is, which parts of analysis can safely delegate to AI and which must stay entirely human-lead? That's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'm not sure I got your second question right. So can you please repeat that? So, Anna,
Yes.
Yeah.
The second or the first, Professor?
There's the second question.
The second question is is about which parts of analysis can we safely delegate to AI, and which parts must stay entirely human-made.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we discussed this a lot currently. I'm not the expert on AI. So the difficult thing with AI is the ethical aspects of data handling. And in Denmark at least, our rules of handling personal information, we are not allowed to share that on a server that is not located, say, in a Danish context, meaning that we cannot use AI for personal information. But we discussed different options at a meeting at our department recently, and I think there is different AI resources coming up that could be helping us in, for example, seeing some patterns that could be supplementing our analysis, but not making the analysis. But we haven't done that yet. I have no experiences with that because we have interviewed young people and teachers with a confidentiality of them sharing sometimes quite personal information. You know, sometimes we interview kids that tell us about difficulties at home, about sharing secrets about their background, and putting that into a server and not being sure how that could end up. In Denmark, where there are only 6 million, could this be coupled with anything personal? We are not quite sure yet, and our university restricts us in using AI for personal data like that. So, but I know other universities have other rules, and I think as a qualitative researcher, it could be interesting to have the AI helping with brainstorming. For example, I have perhaps a specific theory in mind when analyzing data, so it could be interesting to see whether the AI could come up with supplementary ideas. And I think that could be very useful, but I haven't experienced that myself because of the restrictions. So I think the server of ChatGPT would be in the US, and they have not the same law as we have in Denmark in terms of protecting data. So when I have the ethical improvement from my university on data, I promise not to share it with servers that are located all over other places. So, but I think we can use AI for partner brainstorming processes without uploading data. I think still there could be use of AI. But I'm definitely not the right person to ask because I think I'm still a bit hesitant because of the insecurity of the ethical issues. I hope that replies to your answer. Okay, thank you. Okay, more questions. I don't know where the microphone man went. Okay, so we have one question here. Perhaps we need to go upstairs, so people upstairs can also ask questions. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, I'm Zafira Abdezada. I'm currently majoring in physics education. So as you mentioned before, there are a lot of methods that we can use in qualitative research. And I'm really interested in one of the methods, the art-based method. So I just want to know how do you formulate the questions to ask to the interviewee if we use art-based method in our research, and is there any limitations of what kind of topic or what kind of question that we can ask to the interview if we use the art-based method? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the paper that we did on art-based methods shows many examples of different art-based methods. So if you can access that, or I will be happy to share some of the papers if you want that. I think there's not a limit, like art-based methods are very creative, and I think it more depends on the people that you want to do it with. So if you kind of have an activity that you want to integrate, for example, in the interview, it has to fit the persons in the interview. You need to have them on board, but your imagination sets the limitation. But you should in advance think about, okay, how will I use the data? Would they serve as illustrative examples, or can I analyze them in some kind of way? I think that would be helpful to do in advance. I would often integrate that as small. Sometimes I have like 2 activities that involve some kind of active either writing or drawing or something in my interviews. Also because it's quite tense to sit 2 and 2 and talk. It's almost like a psychological session, right? So it's actually nice to break it up with having some questions and then the interviewee doing something and then you're talking about that. It also moves your focus from eye contact and into whatever they produce. So I really like bringing them that into the interview. And I did a lot of different variation. I also have another theory I use is something called future self. So people imagining themselves in the future depends on their current situation. For example, I had one young person I interviewed at the engineering school, and engineers, they really get nice jobs. Everyone gets a job, everyone gets nice payment. But this student was afraid of getting unemployed. And this student was afraid of that because his parents didn't have experienced unemployment. So drawing themselves in the future, like asking people to say, okay, 5 years from now, how would your future looks like, is also something I have used in interview. So drawing activities or making some kind of, the one I did with interest and time, drawing the curve of how you interest evolve, all these things can be integrated nicely. So I think it's about thinking freely about what would fit this context and then explaining carefully what you did and then thinking about how you would analyze that in advance. So you don't end up with a lot of material that is difficult for you to use in your project. So take your research in and then think about, okay, how can this activity fit the research in? And perhaps have some questions in the interview circulating around the activity so you also get some oral conversation about that. That's the way I would go. I hope you could use something like that. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Henriette from BC 2023. You was explaining when you do observation to Christine and you text her. My question is, based on your experience, how can we make a meaningful approach so that we can gather an information that we need for the research, and also how to choose the respondent, because not all of the people willing to open up to us. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think the first question that I texted her, this was a longitudinal project, so I have interviewed her several times, which made me believe that she provided me with a phone number, and we agreed in the interview that when trying to set another interview date, that I would text her. So when I texted her, I said, oh, how are you? She responded, and I was like, just securing with her that it was okay for me to use that as data as well. So I think we could use also emails, students answering emails. I know there's many different formats, whatever works, I would say. But sometimes the written text on text messages and so are very limited. People will not be that elaborated, so it cannot substitute, I think, the whole conversation. And your other question, I forgot it because it's
How to choose respondent is not all of people willing to open up.
Oh yes, if they don't want to open up. I don't think everyone should open up. If they don't want to, I will just say, fair enough, I will not force anyone to say stuff they do not want to say. But I think the longitudinal approach had helped me, but I also I have had time to do that. I know your projects, you probably will not have time to do that, but for me, this is a way to also build a personal connection with them so they feel secure. Also meaning that I get kind of more information from them than I would do if I just said, oh, hi, I'm a researcher, can you tell me about something different? Right, so I think they need to feel a secure space. And this also means that when I'm interviewing students and the teacher asks me, oh, what did this mean?
Last month I visited a disability foundation that accommodations children with mental disabilities. There they are given space to learn and explore many things. And I'm interested in doing research on them. And what do you think are the obstacles that might be encountered when conducting that research? And what's your opinion about that? Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So what disabilities you said?
Mental disabilities.
Yeah, okay. So the first thing that comes to my mind, but that's very exciting, and I think the whole disability area is not something that I have studied. I know there's research out there with that. I know also neurodiversity is coming up, autism spectrum and stuff. And I think there's first important thing would be the ethical, who can provide the consent? Are students able to provide the consent of them being part of your research, and if they are underage, having a dialogue with their parents? But I think you could use, and I think there could be some of these methods, observations, perhaps even some art-based methods that could go depending on the disability and how brave it is. And I think some of these methods would work very well, where I think filling out a survey might be very difficult for this group. And this is also what I mean with you need also to select the methods that both fit your research question, but also actually the group that you interview or the group that you study. For example, some of the art-based methods, there would be some, for example, I did try with some engineering students, and they were like, okay, we make a flip chart diagram instead. So they were not ready to do the drawings. You need to kind of figure out how that fits your target group. And not knowing enough about them, I cannot do I don't know what exactly you should do, but I think interviewing both the teachers, perhaps having some shorter interviews, because I think long interviews, open interviews might be difficult with this group, but perhaps having some questions to some of the things that they're engaged in, small questions, writing that down instead of having a long hour interview, perhaps having some small activities you could do with them and see how they respond to that. But I would think of like smaller time-wise activities with this group, but I definitely think some of these things hopefully could be useful for you as well.
Ini program apa lagi? Ada apa? Mau gimana? Nanti.
I'm curious how students in Denmark think about science, and maybe knowledge or scientists can motivate them, and how a teacher can adapt it with them. Thank you.
Thank you. What scientists did you see? Do you remember the scientists?
I just read about typography.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I thought it might be Ms. Hova, because Ms. Hova is from Denmark. Okay, so so the Danish students, I think science has not been popular for some time in Denmark. I think science has been associated with being extra intelligent, and also that you need to work extra hard in science, and you need to be extra nerdy. So
Hello, my name is Henriette. I'm also from physics education. As we know, education in Indonesia heavily relies on calculation, data, and also formulas. However, in my opinion, visualization, imagination, and also the way material is delivered are also very important, especially in learning science. As a student, I want myself and also my friends to be more open to aspects beyond just numbers.
She says like to kind of use that to empower the imagination of students, to kind of use that. I hope you can find some of the sources.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And I think if there's beginning not to be that many questions, if people have some questions that they are afraid of asking in public, I can hang around for a few minutes. That's okay.
Hello, Prof. I'm Sarah from Indonesia. I'm second year student in physics education. And my question is, I once joined an ASEC forum that focused on SDG 4, is quality education, and it made me think many students feel they are in the wrong major, not because they lack ability, but because their studies don't reflect who they are. Can qualitative research help uncover this disconnect?
Yes. Thank you. Yes, I think so. So students might find themselves in the wrong programs of different reasons. In Denmark, we have huge dropout rates of science. And one thing that I have studied is the transition moving into these programs. And some of the expectations that students might have of this program and what they actually experience when moving into the program. And sometimes there's discrepancies here. For example, some study programs actually, when they do commercials, when they try to tell new students about what they are, they show all the funny stuff. And then when students come in, they will meet, I'm not saying that math is not funny, but they will have a lot of math courses in the beginning in Denmark that they might not think they should have. So for example, moving into biochemistry, on the commercial for biochemistry, you will see someone standing in the lab. But when you move into biochemistry, you will not go to the lab for many, many courses. You will have math and you will have chemistry, biology, but there will not be that much practical. So sometimes it's also about this gap between what we think it is and what it is, at least in Denmark. So I think qualitative studies can help us understand that. And I think it's when students drop out, at least in Denmark, there is this high dropout rates. I hear in Indonesia people that have stayed in the wrong program where they don't feel this sense of belonging. It's too late to ask when it's gone wrong, because then students would have reversed their narrative about why, for example, they dropped out. They would say, oh, but I just didn't fit in. But when you follow them all the time, you can see some of the challenges that occurs. For example, also, we could ask ourselves at the university, why do we put the courses into the program in first year? Do we put the courses into the program of first year because we think that this would be really nice for students? Or do we just build kind of a hierarchical knowledge structure and think they need to learn this and they need to learn this and then they can do the fun stuff? So how do we get kind of the stuff that we, for example, in physics, think physics are, how do we put that into first year curriculum so that we don't have to wait. So that physics and how they are seen as someone in physics by important others. in physics? How do you kind of construct a sense of belonging? So there also need to be room for diversity within the study program, because if you have a very narrow study culture, you might push someone out that might be struggling with C, but I'm not a real physicist. So there is a lot of in and exclusion processes going on in this meeting with students in the new program. And I think both observations and interviews can help us reveal some of these challenges. So thank you so much for raising that question.